April 15, 1943, 20,000 feet above a gray channel, Major Donald Blakesley's leather-gloved hand closed around the Thunderbolt's control stick. Below, a dark shape punched through a ragged cloud layer, a Focke-Wulf 190, its silhouette sudden, compact, predatory. For weeks, the New Republic P-47s had sputtered through training sorties, radios failing and engines temperamental. Now theory would meet reality. Blakesley's sight framed the enemy at 300 yards. He steadied his breath, thumbed the firing switch, and 8 Browning 50s answered like a mechanical thunderclap. Metal spat from wing roots in a synchronized wall, 6,400 rounds per minute by arithmetic, a concentrated cascade of armor-piercing incendiary tracers. The German fighter, elegant in its engineering, unraveled in a spray of flame and twisted metal. In that instant, the Thunderbolt ceased to be merely an aircraft. It became an airborne weapons platform whose doctrine would ripple far beyond a single dogfight. This first triumph did more than claim a single victory. It exposed a fracture in Luftwaffe assumptions. Quantity, when precise and relentless, could overmatch finesse. The P-47's design philosophy, tolerating enormous weight to carry guns, armor, and fuel, had been mocked by European critics as clumsy. Yet industrial discipline at Farmingdale and Evansville turned that perceived flaw into a systemic advantage. Production lines rolled out machines with uncanny regularity. Ammunition plants supplied torrents of rounds with unchanged tolerances. Manufacturing rhythm became strategy. Midway through this first engagement, crews on distant British strips noticed a new sight. Tracer ribbons like solid beams, an optical phenomenon that unnerved veteran adversaries. If you enjoy this deep dive into how industry rewired aerial warfare, subscribe and share. It helps us keep bringing verified histories to light. Behind the visceral spectacle lay statistical inevitability. Early P-47s carried 350 rounds per gun. Later models expanded capacity as engineers iterated. By contrast, German fighters balanced heavier cannon shells with tiny magazines, imposing strict conservation. Luftwaffe doctrine prized careful aim. Republic's approach endorsed suppressed precision through overwhelming deliverable volume. The result was not merely different tactics, but a fundamental shift. Pilots accustomed to counting rounds encountered opponents who could effectively pour lead until targets ceased to exist. That April dogfight signaled a broader campaign transformation. Escort missions multiplied, bomber survivability improved, and ground attack sorties leveraged the same ballistic principle to shred railways and convoys. What began as a cockpit crucible would unfurl across logistics hubs, maintenance sheds, and factories, a theater where manufacturing tempo proved as lethal as gunnery skill. We will follow ACE's testimonies, factory foreman reports, captured technical evaluations, and wartime memos to reveal how mass production remade air combat forever, worldwide implications. The first time Oberfeldwebel Hans Keller returned from combat against the new American fighter, his ground crew could see something different in his eyes. It wasn't exhaustion, it was bewilderment. For months, Keller and his staffel had trusted the Focke-Wulf 190 as the ultimate predator of European skies. With its powerful BMW 801 radial engine, 4 20mm cannons, and nimble roll rate, the machine had earned fearsome respect. But now, the reports he carried back contradicted that confidence. He described the encounter in blunt words. "I opened fire at close range, conserving every shell. The American responded with rivers of fire. It was not a duel, it was an avalanche." His astonishment captured a wider problem for the Luftwaffe. Pilots trained to value accuracy over volume suddenly faced opponents who seemed able to turn the sky itself into a killing zone. The numbers backed the shock. A fully loaded FW-190 typically carried fewer than 500 cannon rounds, often less, depending on configuration. A single high-speed engagement could exhaust that in mere seconds. Meanwhile, the Thunderbolt's machine guns, lighter but far more numerous, could sustain bursts again and again, forcing German pilots to break off or risk disintegration. Tactical maneuvering mattered less when your adversary had ammunition reserves that dwarfed your own. This wasn't only a material imbalance, It gnawed at morale. Luftwaffe briefings began filling with cautionary tales. Avoid head-on passes with Thunderbolts. Do not linger in turning engagements. Always disengage before their gunners settle their sights. Veteran leaders, once sure of their mechanical edge, now admitted privately that the American approach defied old doctrines. The psychological toll deepened with every mission. Crews who once believed their nation's technology superior now watched comrades vanish in firestorms of tracers. Rumors spread that the Allies had abandoned traditional marksmanship altogether, replacing it with industrial slaughter. Such whispers stung German pride, built on precision craftsmanship and the legend of aerial dueling. Strategists in Berlin were not blind to the trend. Reports compiled by the Luftwaffe's General der Jagdflieger Office noted unprecedented expenditure of munitions by American fighters, highlighting the disparity in resupply chains. Factories in the Reich, already strained by bombing and shortages, could not hope to match the steady stream of ammunition crates arriving daily in Britain. For the men in the cockpits, however, this was more than numbers on a chart. Each interception now carried dread of facing an enemy who could fire endlessly while their own belts emptied in a flash. The battlefield dynamic had shifted. Germany's ace-makers found themselves outgunned not by better shooting, but by relentless abundance. In the heartland of the United States, far from the thunder of flak and the roar of engines over Europe, an entirely different battlefield was humming with motion. Assembly lines at Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana, pulsed with the rhythm of rivet guns and conveyor belts. Thousands of workers, many of them women who had never touched machinery before the war, now turned out gleaming Republic P-47 Thunderbolts at a pace that defied belief. Where Germany measured production in the hundreds, America delivered in tens of thousands. At the Lake City ammunition plant in Missouri, the scale was even more staggering. This single facility produced 1.6 billion rounds annually, enough to feed the insatiable appetite of 8 Browning 50 caliber guns across more than 15,000 aircraft. Each cartridge was checked, packed, and shipped in crates that filled entire trains. Ammunition didn't just accompany the Thunderbolt, it was its lifeblood, delivered with mechanical certainty. German intelligence intercepted figures, but initially dismissed them as Allied exaggeration. Yet pilots returning from combat confirmed the evidence firsthand. The volume of fire they faced could not be explained otherwise. Where Luftwaffe squadrons counted every loadout as precious, American flyers seemed to waste ammunition with impunity, knowing another shipment was already crossing the Atlantic. Behind the scenes, this production miracle was no accident. Alexander Kartvelli's design team had argued for a platform that could carry enormous firepower and still endure punishment. The P-47's weight, more than 7 tons when loaded, was the price of that vision. Critics sneered at its bulky frame, calling it a milk bottle with wings. But Republic's engineers understood something deeper. When backed by industry, mass became a weapon. The results were visible in statistics. By 1944, Republic had delivered over 15,783 Thunderbolts, each armed with enough ammunition capacity to overwhelm even elite enemy formations. When combined with the endless flow of cartridges from Lake City, the concept of scarcity disappeared from American strategy. Firepower was no longer rationed, it was unleashed. This convergence of engineering and manufacturing transformed doctrine. American pilots were encouraged to fire in long bursts, blanketing airspace until a target was destroyed. Ground attack missions became exercises in sustained devastation, rail lines and convoys obliterated under relentless strafing. Luftwaffe veterans marveled bitterly at the contrast. German factories struggled to supply spare parts, while American workshops delivered whole fleets. What emerged was not simply a numerical advantage, but a philosophical divide. Germany still fought as though combat was a duel between masters. The United States fought as though combat was an equation, solved through output and logistics. In that equation, the Thunderbolt became the visible proof of a nation's industrial supremacy. On a cold November morning in 1943, over the smoking ruins of a rail yard near Rouen, Hauptmann Erich Meyer found himself locked in a duel that should have favored his Focke-Wulf 190. He dove sharply, rolled with practiced precision, and brought his guns to bear on the American fighter climbing sluggishly below. The Germans' 20mm cannons erupted, but only for a heartbeat. 20 shells gone in seconds. He pulled up, calculating carefully. His ammunition belt had thinned already. The Thunderbolt pilot did not hesitate. With a surge of turbocharged horsepower, the American leveled out, lined up the German silhouette, and unleashed a torrent that lasted longer than Meyer could believe. Streams of incendiary tracers lanced upward like molten ropes. For the first time in his career, he felt hunted not by skill, but by unending firepower. He broke hard left, diving for the cover of cloud, his heart hammering louder than his radial engine. Other Luftwaffe flyers told similar tales. "They never stop shooting," one lieutenant remarked bitterly in a debriefing. "It is not a duel. It is execution." The very psychology of combat tilted. Where once German pilots forced adversaries into conserving ammunition, now the reverse held true. Every pass against a P-47 was a gamble. Either escape quickly or risk being shredded by a storm of lead. American accounts confirmed the imbalance. Pilots of the 56th Fighter Group recalled that long bursts were not only possible but encouraged. "We didn't just fire in short taps," one recalled. "We hosed the sky. If he was in front, we kept the trigger down until he wasn't." That philosophy, backed by the vast reserves of Lake City and other plants, rewrote aerial engagements. Precision was still valued, but volume erased hesitation. The consequences echoed across bomber formations. B-17 crews who had once dreaded German intercepts now watched in awe as Thunderbolts carved bloody corridors through attacking waves. FW-190s that attempted coordinated strikes often found themselves forced apart by withering suppressive fire. The Thunderbolt's 850s weren't just destructive, they were disruptive, breaking the cohesion of German tactics before they could mature. For the Luftwaffe, this was more than tactical frustration. It was cultural dissonance. Their tradition honored the lone ace, the marksman who squeezed the trigger sparingly, making every shot count. Against the P-47, that ethos seemed obsolete. Combat became asymmetric, one side preserving each round as though it were gold, the other treating bullets as endlessly renewable currency. By late 1943, the imbalance was no longer anecdotal. It was systemic. Reports compiled by the German High Command admitted, reluctantly, that American firepower was inexhaustible. In the skies above France, aces learned the bitter truth. Skill could not outlast a flood. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe's tactical manuals were beginning to feel like relics of a bygone era. German doctrine, forged during the Blitzkrieg, stressed efficient bursts of fire and close-range marksmanship. Every pilot was taught that ammunition was finite and that discipline separated survival from disaster. The Focke-Wulf 190 embodied that philosophy, a compact hunter optimized for speed, agility, and heavy, but short-lived, bursts of cannon fire. In contrast, American combat reports revealed a philosophy that sounded alien to German ears. The Thunderbolt wasn't simply a fighter, it was a gunship with wings. U.S. training programs encouraged cadets to practice long trigger squeezes, saturating the air with bullets until their quarry disintegrated. Where German doctrine urged restraint, American instructors repeated a different mantra: keep firing. The effect on strategy was immediate. Luftwaffe squadrons found themselves unable to execute familiar hit-and-run ambushes. Each attack dissolved under blankets of suppressive fire that obscured sight lines and tore into formations. What had once been surgical engagements now resembled survival against an unrelenting storm. Even seasoned veterans confessed that the psychological weight of facing ceaseless gunfire eroded their composure. Strategic planners in Berlin recognized the imbalance but struggled to adapt. Germany's industrial base simply couldn't sustain the ammunition expenditure that such a doctrine demanded. With Allied bombing campaigns crippling production and fuel shortages already limiting sortie rates, there was no hope of matching America's rhythm. Instead, Luftwaffe leaders clung to the belief that superior training and individual brilliance might offset material disparity. In reality, That calculation grew weaker with every month. On the American side, the Thunderbolt's philosophy meshed perfectly with broader Allied strategy. High Command understood that overwhelming firepower wasn't just about destroying enemy aircraft. It was about breaking the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the skies at all. The P-47's relentless barrages created safe corridors for bombers, dismantled enemy morale, and disrupted ground logistics with equal efficiency. Mass production wasn't only about replacing losses, it was about ensuring that pilots never had to hesitate. To Luftwaffe analysts, the contrast was chilling. Reports circulated describing Thunderbolt pilots expending thousands of rounds in a single mission, often returning with empty belts yet satisfied results. For a German ace accustomed to firing no more than a handful of shells per fight, the scale was almost incomprehensible. It underscored a truth few wanted to admit. The very concept of air combat had shifted. By the spring of 1944, the old image of the aerial duel, two knights clashing with skill and restraint, had been buried. In its place stood a new paradigm. War as an industrial equation, measured not by daring, but by throughput. And in that equation, the Thunderbolt reigned supreme. By mid-1944, the numerical story of the air war was no longer in doubt. Republic Aviation had delivered more than 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts, a figure that dwarfed Germany's capacity to field new Focke-Wulfs. Each week, American factories produced hundreds of fresh aircraft, while the Reich scrambled to replace even a fraction of its losses. This disparity wasn't abstract. It translated directly into squadrons appearing at Allied airfields faster than Luftwaffe intelligence could track them. Supporting this torrent of airframes was an equally relentless tide of ammunition. The Lake City plant, running at near-continuous shifts, shipped boxcars filled with cartridges across the continent to East Coast ports. From there, Liberty ships carried the cargo across the Atlantic, ensuring that every P-47 in England or Italy could be armed without delay. German officers marveled grimly at captured manifests that listed billions of rounds in transit, each crate stamped with fresh factory codes. It was a scale that exceeded imagination. Meanwhile, the Reich's industrial lifelines shrank by the month. Allied bombing pulverized rail hubs and machine shops, leaving production uneven and vulnerable. Factories that once rolled out Focke-Wulfs at tempo slowed to a crawl. Spare parts became scarce, ammunition shipments were delayed, and even frontline aces began to fly with reduced loads. While the Thunderbolt enjoyed excess, the FW-190 entered battle under constraints. This imbalance eroded more than numbers. It shattered strategic flexibility. Luftwaffe commanders could no longer rotate squadrons freely, for fear of depleting fuel and ammunition stockpiles. Missions had to be rationed, interception schedules shortened. Against this backdrop, the Americans extended their reach. Thunderbolts escorted bombers deeper into occupied Europe, sustained by drop tanks, and the certainty that every sortie could be resupplied without hesitation. Statistical comparisons became damning, where an American fighter group consumed hundreds of thousands of rounds in a single month. Luftwaffe formations struggled to match even a fraction. Reports from maintenance depots revealed shortages so severe that some FW-190s were dispatched with only partial loads. A pilot might carry cannon shells in one wing route and none in the other. Such compromises were unthinkable for the Americans, whose supply chains never allowed emptiness. Numbers alone told the story of inevitability. The Thunderbolt's 8 guns didn't simply fire more, they fired more often, over longer campaigns, with deeper logistical reserves behind them. Every crate that rolled off an American assembly line reinforced the doctrine of sustained firepower. For Germany, every delay, every shortage was another crack in an already strained system. By late summer, Luftwaffe analysts conceded privately what they could not admit publicly. They were being outproduced into extinction. In the contest between precision and abundance, industry had chosen the victor long before the final dogfights played out. Summer 1944. France's countryside trembled under a new rhythm of war. Low-flying Thunderbolts, their wings heavy with ammunition, swept over rail lines and highways like steel predators. Farmers and villagers alike learned to recognize the growl of Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines, followed by the thunderous cascade of 8 Brownings cutting loose on trains, trucks, and fuel depots. The firepower once reserved for aerial duels was now turned downward, transforming the P-47 into a weapon of infrastructure annihilation. Locomotives were among the first victims. American reports listed more than 9,000 trains destroyed or disabled by strafing runs. Engineers tasked with keeping German supply networks alive described their hopeless task. Tracks twisted by explosions, engines left smoking hulks, bridges collapsing under constant attack. What the Luftwaffe could not prevent in the skies, the Thunderbolt achieved at ground level with merciless efficiency. For German troops on the move, the psychological toll was immense. Columns of infantry marching under the sun suddenly scattered into ditches as the unmistakable roar drew closer. Armored vehicles that once felt invulnerable to small arms crumpled under relentless streams of incendiary rounds. Survivors recounted the sense of helplessness. The American fighters seemed to appear without warning, spray endless ammunition, and vanish into the horizon before any countermeasure could be organized. Attempts to intercept these raiders faltered. FW-190 squadrons, already strained by fuel shortages, rarely had the numbers to mount coordinated defenses. Those who did rise faced the same barrage that had terrorized them in dogfights, rivers of tracers that forced premature disengagement. Even when German pilots pressed an attack, they often found themselves outnumbered, their ammunition gone long before the Thunderbolts exhausted theirs. The strategic results were devastating. German logistics, already frayed by Allied bombing, buckled under constant interdiction. Ammunition meant for frontline divisions never arrived. Fuel reserves evaporated on railway sidings. Replacement parts for aircraft and tanks languished in destroyed depots. Every mission flown by the P-47 multiplied these pressures, compounding the Reich's inability to sustain operations. American commanders recognized this shift and leaned into it. Fighter groups were tasked not only with bomber escort, but with systematic hunting of enemy supply lines. In after-action reports, pilots described targeting rail yards and vehicle convoys with the same ferocity they once reserved for enemy aircraft. The results were counted in immobilized divisions, stranded panzers, and demoralized infantry. By late 1944, the P-47's reputation had transcended the dogfight. For German soldiers, it symbolized unstoppable destruction from above, an aircraft that could outgun their fighters and dismantle their lifelines with equal ruthlessness. It was not just air superiority, it was economic warfare, delivered one strafing run at a time. By the autumn of 1944, the Luftwaffe found itself trapped in a paradox of its own creation. The FW-190, once hailed as the pinnacle of German engineering, no longer fit the realities of aerial warfare. Designed for fast strikes and hit-and-run engagements, it was now forced into prolonged defensive battles against fleets of Thunderbolts that could absorb punishment, deliver overwhelming firepower, and still outlast their opponents in the sky. German fighter doctrine, perfected during earlier campaigns, had relied on tight formations, coordinated dives, and the element of surprise. Against the P-47, these principles disintegrated. The Thunderbolt's sheer durability meant that even when a 190 pilot successfully struck an opponent, the American machine often refused to go down. Many German aces admitted in debriefings that emptying an entire cannon burst into a Thunderbolt's fuselage did not guarantee a kill. By contrast, a single mistake on their part meant exposure to a wall of 50 caliber fire that could shred their aircraft in seconds. The Luftwaffe attempted adaptation. New Sturmgruppen units, flying heavily armed FW-190 variants, were tasked with breaking through Thunderbolt screens to reach Allied bombers. The concept was brutal but desperate. Approach in armored wedges, trade casualties for damage. Yet even here, the doctrine faltered. The P-47 pilots, with faster climbs and coordinated escorts, intercepted these formations before they ever reached their targets. The few that broke through often lacked the fuel to return home. Behind the lines, commanders faced grim statistics. Pilot training programs were shortened to weeks. Fresh recruits were thrown into combat against seasoned Americans who had already flown dozens of sorties. The disparity was glaring. Inexperienced Luftwaffe rookies flying outdated tactics against disciplined Thunderbolt groups trained in both dogfighting and ground attack. Losses spiraled, morale collapsed, and entire squadrons ceased to function. Propaganda still hailed the FW-190 as a symbol of German resilience, but in the skies, its reputation crumbled. Allied intelligence intercepted reports describing aircraft shortages, maintenance nightmares, and fuel starvation. The once feared 190 was increasingly relegated to secondary theaters, used for harassing attacks rather than decisive battles. Pilots themselves whispered of the aircraft's obsolescence, acknowledging that survival no longer depended on skill alone, but on sheer luck. By the time winter arrived, the contrast was undeniable. The FW-190 was a relic of an earlier phase of the war, trapped in outdated doctrine and betrayed by the empire that had once depended on it. Against the Thunderbolt, it no longer represented dominance, it represented desperation. If combat was where the P-47 asserted its dominance, production lines were where America secured ultimate victory. While German commanders wrestled with shrinking resources, Allied factories operated at a scale that defied comprehension. Every Thunderbolt sent into combat was not just a machine, it was the embodiment of an industrial empire mobilized for war. The numbers alone told a story of inevitability. Between 1941 and 1945, Republic Aviation produced 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts. Each carried 850 caliber Browning M2s, weapons that could be fed endlessly thanks to the Lake City ammunition plant, which churned out an astonishing 1.6 billion rounds annually. By contrast, German industry, under constant bombing, could barely keep up. Factories in Marienburg and Bremen were hit repeatedly, forcing production of FW-190s into fragmented workshops where output lagged and quality suffered. The Luftwaffe's logistical nightmare compounded the crisis. Ammunition for the FW-190's cannons was limited, and resupply often lagged days behind operational needs. The 20mm and 30mm shells required for effective bomber interception were expensive, slow to manufacture, and transported through a network crippled by Allied bombing raids on railroads and depots. By 1944, many FW-190 pilots were ordered to ration ammunition, firing in brief bursts to conserve shells. Meanwhile, their American adversaries never faced such restrictions. Thunderbolts could fly into combat with belts of thousands of 50 caliber rounds and expend them liberally, knowing full resupply awaited them upon landing. Fuel shortages added another chokehold. While American Thunderbolts refueled from virtually limitless supplies brought across the Atlantic, FW-190 pilots often received barely enough gasoline for a single sortie. Luftwaffe planners calculated missions not by tactical need, but by fuel availability, reducing combat flights and ceding initiative to the Allies. The industrial imbalance was not just about machines. It was psychological. German pilots stepping into the cockpit of an FW-190 knew they were flying into combat with finite ammunition, dwindling spares, and thinning fuel reserves. Their adversaries flew P-47s maintained by endless replacement parts, armed with endless ammunition, and backed by a nation that seemed immune to scarcity. This contrast gnawed at morale, stripping away the aura of invincibility the Luftwaffe had once enjoyed. By late 1944, the FW-190 was less an equal rival and more a casualty of systemic collapse. The Thunderbolt did not merely win duels in the sky, it represented the triumph of an economy capable of sustaining war at a scale Germany could never match. In the battle between tactical brilliance and industrial might, mass production proved the ultimate weapon. When the war finally drew to its bloody conclusion in 1945, the skies over Europe no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. The FW-190, once Germany's pride, lay scattered across fields and forests, silent wreckage of an empire that had wagered on skill over scale. In their place soared the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, heavy, unglamorous machines that had rewritten the rules of air combat not with elegance, but with relentless firepower and industrial certainty. For the men who flew them, the lesson was unmistakable. In the earliest days, Luftwaffe pilots mocked the Thunderbolt as an ungainly giant, a 7-ton milk bottle with wings. Yet on the battlefield, mockery gave way to fear. German aviators discovered that the Jug could absorb punishment no other fighter could withstand, strike with a hurricane of 50 caliber fire unmatched in volume, and return to the skies again and again, supplied by an inexhaustible arsenal. To them, the P-47 was less a rival aircraft and more a symbol of America's unshakable capacity to wage total war. Historians today often ask whether the outcome would have been different had Germany matched the Thunderbolt's industrial scale. The evidence suggests otherwise. Even if the FW-190 had evolved further, it would have been starved by the same bottlenecks that plagued the Reich: limited fuel, strained supply chains, and factories shattered by Allied bombers. Against an enemy that could replace machines and men at a pace beyond imagination, tactical brilliance alone could not prevail. But the true legacy of the P-47 lies deeper than statistics. Its 8 Browning 50 caliber guns, capable of unleashing 6,400 rounds per minute, did more than shred enemy fighters or rip locomotives from the tracks. They symbolized a strategic transformation, the moment when air combat shifted from the domain of individual aces to the realm of industrial annihilation. The P-47 was the embodiment of a new kind of war, one where victory was determined not by daring duels in the clouds, but by production lines, logistics, and the will to outsupply as much as outfight. And yet beyond its cold efficiency, the Jug carried a human weight. For Allied pilots, it was a shield that brought them home. For German airmen, it was a harbinger of despair, a machine that reminded them daily that their nation's promise of dominance was slipping away. In the end, the Thunderbolt proved more than just an aircraft. It was a message written in steel and fire, that in the greatest conflict of the modern age, industry could triumph over ideology, and that the fate of nations could be decided not only by courage in the cockpit, but by the endless rhythm of machines on the factory floor.